All right. First, a disclaimer, yada, yada, yada. I think I know this one from memory by now. My favorite line on the slide is technical feasibility and market demand may affect final product delivery date. Like how I did that without even looking? It's practice is what that is. All right. Brief agenda, intro, kind of why are we here, what are the key things that we care about with this, a demo, mostly focused on the user side, and then I'll talk about what the components are that come with vCloud Director, that are part of vCloud Director, that are used to build a private or public cloud. And then Dushyant will walk through the process of actually building a cloud. What are the components you do, like what are the steps you go through, et cetera, kind of a high-level blueprint for setting up your cloud. Dushyant has probably set up and installed VCD more times than anyone else,
too many times.
Too many times, yes, because there was a lot of tear it down, bring it back up with the latest build, the latest, et cetera, et cetera. We fixed that bug. Go ahead and rebuild during the dev process. So he's a pretty key expert on all of that. All right. With all that said, why do we care? Right? So at the end of the day, why do we care about cloud? We care about cloud not necessarily because it's cool technology, although that certainly is a motivating factor. We care about cloud because it allows us to get to these key principles that VMware's cloud is built around here. We want to deliver more efficiency for you, for the IT staff. We want to deliver more agility. And we also want to deliver freedom of choice to run your own internal infrastructure or consume infrastructure that's running at somebody else's facility. We want to deliver that in a way that is scalable, that is elastic, that is easy to consume, and that then pivots over to the end user point of view. Okay? So we're going to talk a lot about what, and I want to try and spend a few minutes at the beginning talking about the why of what are the benefits you're really going to get from cloud. Okay? And I'm not going to read through this marketing slide. Okay? I do want to kind of set the context of where we are today as well. Most of you have probably seen a picture that looks very much like this, I believe. Yes? Nods? No? Yes? Maybe? Hungover? Okay. We're going to be talking about the infrastructure layer today. So infrastructure as a service, IT as a service at that infrastructure layer is what VCD provides. Now, for those of you that did not see the keynote yesterday, there were some references to a rapidly iterating process of naming that we went through for this. And so if I slip up and say VCSD, you should attribute that to my own lack of sleep this week. vCloud Director or Redwood are the two names that I'm supposed to be using for this because I think the name Redwood was one of those poorly kept secrets. This is a workflow process. This is the process of provisioning a new VM for a user, or a new workload for a user, excuse me, when cloud is not in place. Right? Reasonably complex, hard to understand, hard to walk through. I could walk through every step in this, but you would all be bored. I'm going to skip over that and say that the real problem that is shown in this picture is that there is no separation between the consumer and the producer, that the line between consumer and producer gets wandered back and forth across multiple times. And that means that in order for the consumer to get something, there's a lot of interaction between the producer is doing something and then the consumer is doing something and back and forth, and there's no good separation of roles. Okay? So those cloud personas are very important. Okay? That IT producer, IT consumer, separating those two things apart allows us to get a lot better efficiency, allows us to operate much more effectively as an IT organization. So the cloud administrator is the person who maintains IT. And generally speaking, I'm going to make a gross generalization that is you. You guys, generally speaking, are probably IT admins. Out of curiosity, how many people in here are either not IT admins or not people who sell to IT admins? Because I see some EMC guys in the room. Okay, a small number.
Very small.
I apologize for making gross generalizations that do not include you. Okay. A little accurate. All right. The consumer side, and this is something that's distinguished about vCloud Director and is an important distinction, separates out two roles on the consumer side. So first of all, there's that separation between producing IT assets and capacity and consuming them. But in the same way that not all of your users are equally technical or equally able, cloud consumers should not be presumed to all be equally the same. And in fact, one of the things that VCD provides is a really robust solution for role-based access control. So we separate out the consumption administrator, that is the organization admin, somebody who sets up an organization, configures it, etc., and the cloud consumer, which is the actual end user, the person who really does the consumption. And that separation, that additional layer of kind of authentication or of authorization is really the better word for it, is unique to VCD among most of the cloud solutions out there, and is really important, I think, because it allows, when you move out towards public clouds, when you start to build those hybrid clouds, it allows you, the IT admin, to act in an administrative way, to broker that relationship with an external cloud provider and provide the service to your, in turn, end users. It allows, when you're building a private cloud, it allows you to build that cloud and then delegate control to, for example, the IT guy in the finance department, the guy who does the IT for them, who's your liaison over there, to set up the organization and maintain it so that there is some separation between the people powering the cloud workloads, that is the producers, and the people consuming the cloud workloads. Okay? I'm going to show you kind of what the product looks like from the consumer point of view now. All right. So this is just a little bit of an expansion on the demo we showed during the keynote, really. So we're going to log in as a user, and you'll notice that my username here is user. Okay. And as I said repeatedly, the key thing about this is that it is a simple interface. It's easy to understand. It's straightforward. I can go up here to Add Cloud Computer System. I don't even have to know terms like VApp, although they'll show up here. And choose from a catalog that's been provided to me by IT, because again, we want to push self-service out to those end users, all while maintaining IT control. And we'll talk about some of the controls in Duchamp's talk through the building up of the cloud. Okay? So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select the RHEL 5 machine, and I'm going to go ahead over here and click Next. Go up here and put the name in there. And you'll notice that I get to choose what virtual data center I'm deploying in. Those virtual data centers in this case are simply named Silver, Gold, Bronze. You could also put in the name, for example, 20 cents per VM hour and so forth, so that people have a good feedback loop for how much this is going to cost them if you're an organization that does do chargeback. Okay? If I don't have multiple virtual data centers inside of my organization, I don't even get to select this. It's just, this is the virtual data center you're landing in. Really reducing the amount of understanding of the infrastructure, understanding of the way IT is done that people need to have in order to operate. Okay? We're going to open up the leases here, and the leases are a way of automatically reclaiming capacity from the infrastructure so that at the end of specified periods of time, we automatically suspend or automatically delete, or hide is a better way of thinking about it, from the user the workloads that they've got running. And this is a particularly useful feature in a private cloud environment. Okay? You'll notice that I have a lot of options for leases here. That's because the admin, that is me who set up this environment, didn't choke down the controls. You can also set it up such that there is a maximum lease that any user can select. So I can say, you can provision any machine you want as long as you provision it for 7 days. And then at the end of those 7 days, you'll get a reminder that you either need to renew that lease manually, or you need to let the machine expire. And this is really nice because it takes advantage of people's laziness. If they don't really need the machine, they don't renew the lease and so forth. And that reduces the kind of hoarding behavior. Yes?
Why do I get to choose lease policies for virtual data center?
You get to choose lease. So the question is, do I get to choose lease policies per VDC or per organization? The answer is per organization. You can set a lease policy, a maximum lease policy. Okay,
and that's configurable by the cloud administrator when you set up the organization.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and we'll start provisioning that. While that's provisioning, I'm going to open up this other application that we have here, and you'll notice, again, a multi-tier application deployed here. It's a 3-tier app, 3 machines here. The first thing to point out is that my Apache machine has 2 NICs, while the MySQL machine and Tomcat each have 1 NIC. You can, if I mouse over this, you'll see the IP addresses of each of them. Okay? Notice that they're on different networks. All 3 of these machines are connected to this, which is the infra auction network. Okay? So the infrastructure auction network, the network that is entirely contained inside of this VApp. Okay? So that's the first thing, is that this is a VApp network. It's entirely contained inside of the VApp, and it's connected via firewall to the Promontory Software Network, which is the network for this organization that extends out externally. The Apache machine is also connected directly to that Promontory Software Network. Because like a 3-tier app, you'd want all of your machines on a private network and one of your machines to hang out onto the public network so that it can be accessed via web servers and so forth. This firewall, for example, might be set up to allow what's a good example? To allow port 22 in only, so that you can only SSH into these machines, but you can get in via web and so forth. And of course, I can open up the console and I can insert CD and DVD and so forth. I can download an RDP file, not useful for Linux, but for Windows, if you don't want people having remote consoles open, you can get the RDP shortcut right here from the browser. Okay. Questions about that? Okay. Yes.
So in your demo, when you built the VM, you didn't ever have a chance to select what network you wanted.
Right.
So how does that?
Great question. So the question was, when I built the VM, I didn't ever get a chance to select what network it landed on. What I was actually doing when I grabbed that VM was I grabbed a vApp that was pre-built called RHEL 5, which has its own networking all laid out, and that will deploy out. Once it's out there, then I can connect the networks inside of that vApp out. I intentionally chose one that would go relatively simply for this, but there are additional steps that one can go through if one has the appropriate permissions to connect networking during the provisioning process. So in this case, I have the permissions to grab things out of the catalog. I don't have permissions to create a net new vApp. And that's something that potentially you'd want to do if you wanted to say, you are only allowed to deploy things that are in the catalog. You can't start from scratch and build your own vApp that runs your iTunes server or what have you. I don't want you to do that. You can only do this. Okay? All right. So we showed the UI. That's how you access the thing from the user interface. There's also a consumer side of the API, right? That is the vCloud API. You want to be able to interact with the cloud programmatically. Programmatically, in this case, means RESTful. I like to joke that if this was 3 years ago, I would be telling you it was a SOAP API and that was the way of the future. 3 years from now, I'm sure there will be some other format that is the way of the future. I actually do think REST has some advantages over SOAP. There's some presumptions about state being local versus remote and so forth. It is 100% virtual, which means that there are no physical constructs that are exposed through that API, and I can't emphasize how critical that is, because that's the thing that allows for true hybrid cloud. That's the thing that allows you to build tooling against one cloud, change the URL that you are pointing at, and point at another cloud. If you're tying into the physical resources underneath it, you never have the option to do that. You've lost that entire ability, and that's one of the real values that you get out of cloud, is that Mike DiPetrillo calls it the I don't care factor. Right? I don't care where this runs. I just want it to run. Okay? There are two logical APIs, and it's worth pointing that out because we'll occasionally kind of mix them up, but it's important to separate these. The vCloud API is what I just talked about. That's that consumer API, the standard way to consume vCloud resources. There is also an API for the IT producer, and you can see us starting to talk a little bit about producer now. You can see what's coming in terms of transition. And that is the admin API, right? So someone who would administratively interact with VCD so that they would build up the cloud programmatically. If they wanted to add physical resources and automate inserting them into VCD, that would be the API that they would use. Okay? So the cloud components here, I'm not going to walk through this picture, but this is a nice architecture, which is reasonably accurate, etc. All right. Very quickly, I'll build up the components, and then I'm going to hand off to Dushyant to talk about how you would assemble these components together. The first thing is, of course, vSphere and vCenter. You are well versed in those technologies and those concepts. Two things that I would point out. You need DRS, which means you need at least Enterprise, and we will strongly recommend Enterprise Plus, and I'll talk about why that is, or Dushyant will talk about why that is as we get a little deeper in. Networking is it's a lot more complex and cumbersome if you don't have Enterprise Plus. One of the things to point out that's really critical here is that you can have multiple vCenter servers underlying your VCD. VCD is designed to run at a single location, but if you can make multiple locations feel like one location with network stretching and so forth, that you'll be okay. Okay? Installation licensing. It is licensed, well, we'll talk about the installation piece. As I said, we do support Enterprise, although Enterprise Plus is strongly recommended. I talked about some of the minimum requirements. Oracle database on the back end. Afterwards, if we have questions, I can explain why it's Oracle. That is not a long-term decision. That is a 1.0 ship the product decision. Okay. VCD also comes with vShield Edge for vCloud Director. There is a vShield manager that gets installed on vCenter to manage the Edge device. After that, all of the networking is managed, or all of the firewalling and so forth is managed from Redwood. This is included with VCD, so you'll get 2 licenses when you purchase VCD. One is the vShield for vCloud Director, and one is the actual VCD license. Okay? Chargeback Manager is not part of VCD, but there is a promotional bundle that is running right now where you get both products together for less than either of them costs individually. No, that's not quite true. For the per VM charge for VCD list price is $150 per VM. The per VM charge for chargeback list price is $50 per VM. The promotional bundle has both products together for $100 per VM. So reasonably good deal there.
So when you walk out the door, you'll be able to pick it up for $100 a VM.
Exactly.
No pressure.
Chargeback Manager integrates with VCD. Okay? So now we're going to hand over to Dushyant, and he's going to talk about the producer side and really build up that cloud producer picture. So we've talked about why we want to do this. Now we're going to talk about the how we're going to do this.
All right. Thanks, Eddie. All right. So what Eddie showed you in the demo was how easy it is to do infrastructure as a service, right? So the demo was all about, bring up a catalog, select the vApp that you want. And we didn't show you the networking piece, but that's something that you can enable the users to create on the fly. So it's really about getting IT out of the way. And Eddie started out with this picture, which is kind of confusing and ugly, right? And that's today. And we're trying to take that and we're trying to turn that picture into something that's a little bit more organized. That's a clear delegation of roles in which IT is able to do a lot of things ahead of time, set up a lot of things ahead of time once, and then turn it over to users on a day-to-day basis to come in and consume capacity as a service. So what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of the talk is the producer side or the IT side of the house. So this could be an enterprise IT administrator, or if it's service provider, somebody that stands up the cloud infrastructure. Again, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this picture to sort of guide us through the talk. Fundamentally, you guys know vSphere, so you know the abstractions that vSphere exposes, right? So you've got hosts, storage, and networking, and you've abstracted that with port groups, data stores, and resource pools. So this is something that you're familiar with. So we're going to take that concept, and then we're going to build one more layer on top, which allows you to build pure virtual abstraction. So we're going to build these new containers. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up what we call a management cluster. So Eddie talked about the components, right? So you've got vCloud Director, you've got the databases, you've got Chargeback Manager, vShield Edge, which is powered by vShield Manager. All of these go in what we call a management cluster. Again, this is really about best practices, right? So what do you need? To build a cloud, you need to have a very solid foundation. Remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to get IT to turn it over to end users, and when end users start consuming capacity, you want to make sure that everything is solid. So what does that mean, right? So NTP availability, DNS, AD, redundancy, right? Backup, disaster recovery, all the things that you need to be sure that when you turn it over to IT, hell doesn't break loose. I mean, when you turn it over to end users, hell doesn't break loose, and you can actually feel comfortable turning it over to end users. So really, best practices. And create a management cluster protected with best practices. And then we're going to take things that vSphere and vCenter, and then we're going to add it to vCloud Director. So 2 things you're going to add. So vCloud Director spans 25 vCenter servers, so you can add up to 25 vCenter servers. And this is not about taking an entire vCenter server and saying, okay, you're building a cloud of this. You can select portions of the vCenter server to power the cloud. So you can continue to run portions of your infrastructure in a non-cloud way, and you can cloudify a portion of your vSphere infrastructure. And you can do this using multiple vCenter servers. You do require a vShield manager, which gives you the edge component running in each vCenter server that you add to the cloud, right? So this needs to be available ahead of time. And with vCloud Director, you get vShield manager, so you get the edge functionality included and integrated into vCloud Director. Cloud resources. So standardization is key when you're building a cloud, right? So when you saw in the demo, Eddie selected, gold, silver, bronze. And those are standardized tiers. Those are shared infrastructures, little containers we call virtual data centers, which are the same to everyone. Everyone in the cloud that wants access to it, wants that container and is willing to pay for it, can get access to it. So it's fundamentally a shared object. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna look across the infrastructure and we're gonna start creating these virtual data centers. So what we've done so far is we've taken some of our vCenter servers in our infrastructure and we've given them to the cloud layer. Now we're looking across and we're building standardized containers. And these containers are differentiated by SLAs that they offer and perhaps costs. Obviously not all storage costs the same, not all compute costs the same, and and the SLAs are different. And when things are different, you create different virtual data centers out of them. Fundamentally, what they do is they provide compute and storage. So what you're combining is either a cluster or a resource pool in vCenter server with a bunch of data stores. And vCloud Director at that point creates a virtual data center and treats them as one giant pool of compute and one giant pool of storage. And that is a virtual data center. Examples of virtual data centers, you could combine, so if you're creating virtual data centers for storage, and for those of you taking notes, and if I'm going through this very fast, we will be posting these slides after the talk. It'll be available for download at the end of the talk, so don't feel free to put your things on, and you don't have to try to keep up with me. And I kind of speak fast. Okay, fast, medium, slow, compute and storage. So you could form virtual data centers which are differentiated by their speed. Or if you have different types of storage in your infrastructure, SATA being, slow, create a silver VDC out of them, your fiber channel being, gold, platinum being enterprise flash drives, and if you've got the latest and greatest, the aggregate type storage, you create your unobtainium. We joke about this internally, your unobtainium VDCs out of these. So Eddie mentioned that DRS is a requirement. So one way of thinking, and vMotion is a requirement, enhanced vMotion compatibility is a requirement. So vCloud Director depends on, and kind of so this is a very flexible environment, and ESX host can come and ESX host can go out. So DRS is a requirement. So you could think of combining your AMD-based machines into a VDC, just as a logical way of combining them, or your latest and greatest Nehalem-based ESX hosts and combine them into a cluster, put some storage in and create a virtual data center out of that. So fundamentally, the idea is it's a shared resource. So that's compute and storage. What about networking? Two types of networking. The first one is going to be a shared one, which is an external network. And you can think of, so external networks are powered by port groups from DV switches or vNetwork, or I should say vNetwork distributed switches, or switches that are Cisco Nexus 1000V type switches. So these are networks which have SLAs or quality of service or whatever it is. I mean, it's a differentiated network that you have available in your vSphere infrastructure, and you say, here you go, I'm going to take this network and I'm going to give it to the cloud to be used as a shared object, right? So anyone in the cloud, and these are external because no one organization, we'll talk about organizations a little bit, no one organization owns this network. Right? So if VM or if VApps from different organizations connect to this external network, and if they all get an IP directly on it, they can obviously see each other. So it's a shared resource. And you could think of things like the internet, or this could be, we talk about the hybrid cloud use case, right? So this could be a VPN connection between your enterprise data center and your service provider. So these sit outside of the cloud in that sense, outside of the organizations, and the organizations and the VApps that live in the organization can access them as a shared resource. Okay, network pools. So these are the building blocks. So you asked the question in the beginning of the demo: can users create networks? Right. So when you start creating organization networks and VApp networks, which isolate the communication between VMs in a VApp, we'll talk about VApps a little bit later. This is the building block that they depend on. Right. So what IT does here is create a so basically, it's a vNetwork distributed switch, and you say, here's a vNetwork distributed switch. You hand that over to the cloud, and you say, when users come in and request networks, you create a network from this vNetwork distributed. So it's an automated way. So vCloud Director spins up a network. There's different ways. I'll show you the different ways of isolating traffic within the different networks. But fundamentally, what you're doing is IT can get out of the way of provisioning networks when users want access to networking resources inside of organizations or inside of VApps. Okay, so three ways of creating network pools. So you could have the most simple, I don't want to say simplest, but the first way is a Portgroup-backed network pool. So what you're doing is there's a vNetwork distributed switch. There's a bunch of port groups that are already created. You've done something to isolate these port groups, right? It's either physical isolation or you've got VLANs in place. What you're saying to vCloud Director is, here's 10 port groups. When users come in and ask for networks, use these port groups to create those networks. When somebody creates a network, one network is taken away from the pool, and when they get rid of the network, it's returned back to the pool for somebody else in the cloud to use, right? But it's fundamentally isolated. So if one organization creates a network, nobody else in another organization can access any of the vApps that are in that network because you've done the isolation. VLAN-backed, this is where you get into the power of, so in the port group-backed one, you have to create the port groups ahead of time. You have to isolate them. There's a little bit of manual work. With the VLAN-backed, it's done in an automated fashion. Fundamentally, what you tell vCloud Director is, here's a vNetwork distributed switch. Here's a range of VLANs, 100 to 110. So vCloud Director can create up to 11 networks using those VLAN ranges, right? Again, best practices, when you create VLAN-backed network pools, just make sure that nobody else in the organization is using that VLAN range, because vCloud Director is depending on you to do the right thing and give the right. I mean, it's assuming that you've done the isolation, right? So if somebody else is sitting on a VLAN, they're obviously going to be able to see that traffic going by. So it's just best practices. And the last one is network isolation. So vCloud Director network isolation back. This is VMware technology, which allows you to create overlaid networks on top of an underlying transport network without the use of VLANs for separation. So you give vCloud Director a distributed switch and a VLAN tag, and it can create multiple networks on top, and each of these are isolated. Again, same case as VLANs. It's when you give vCloud Director a vNetwork distributed switch, just make sure that nobody else is sitting on that, because it's fundamentally wide open. ESX is guaranteeing isolation so just make sure that the only hosts accessing that are hosts participating in the cloud.
The best way to think about that transport network is as if it's a wide open trunk port for a VLAN. So imagine you had trunked all of the VLANs in your environment to one host. That's how securely you would have to treat that port. That's how securely you should treat the transport network that's carrying the VCDNI traffic.
Cool. Any questions? So we've talked about cloud infrastructures, right? Yeah, sure. Well, I said 100 to 110, so 11 VLANs. No, sorry. So, could you repeat that question? So
what is the limit? It's 11 VLANs or what?
It's not 11. The limit isn't 11 VLANs. The example was 11.
So I said if you have a range of 100 to 110, then vCloud Director can create 11 VLANs. It is not a limit. You can create 12. As an example.
There is no, the limit is, generally speaking, is 1,000 networks per network pool. So you can use a quarter of the available VLAN ID address space per network pool.
Cool. I'm glad we cleared that one up.
Very cloudy, 11 networks.
vCloud Director only creates 11 networks. I'd have lost my job over it.
Other questions?
Any other questions? Yeah. So the question is, are we using vShield Zones or vShield App? We're only using vShield Edge. For those of you, so we introduced 3 products yesterday we GA'd 3 products: vShield App, vShield Endpoint, and vShield Edge. And this product is using and has integrated vShield Edge technologies. There's no app or any other technology or zones in this product.
And I'll comment as the product manager that integrating with the zones/app, that sort of style, is something that we're looking very closely at for the future, because I think there's some features of those things that work really well in a cloudy world. There's some integration work we need to do.
Cool. So now that we've taken vCenters and vSpheres and vCenter servers, and we've given them up to the cloud layer, and you said create shared objects out of these. So we've created virtual data centers, and we've created external networks and network pools. Now we need to start layering on organizations. So these are where, so what we're going to do now is organizations are the unit of tenancy, right? So examples of organizations, if you're looking at a corporate IT infrastructure, these could be finance, IT, sales, engineering, or in the service provider case, this could be entire organization. So this could be a real company like Dunder Mifflin and Anytech, right? A real company. So users belong to these organizations, and then when you create an organization in vCloud Director, it creates a net new URL for that organization. So users come in, everyone logs into the same system, it's one instance of vCloud Director, but each organization has a unique URL that users come into, and then they type in their credentials. How do you authenticate against the system? So there's a role-based, there's 3 ways of authenticating. You can authenticate locally against the vCloud Director database per organization, or you could have one LDAP or AD server for the entire cloud, and organizations simply become OUs inside this. Or if you already have, one example is cloud is really useful when you have users that you want to onboard quickly. There's it's leveraging existing investments, and let's say that you're going out and making an acquisition, right? And you want to bring those people into the cloud, but they already have their own existing AD and authentication infrastructure. In that last case, you could create a separate LDAP or an AD server per organization in the cloud. So again, leveraging existing investments. You don't have to tear down their infrastructure and port all of that into your cloud AD, so you could just have them powered by their own AD servers or LDAP servers. There are users, groups, and roles. There's role-based access control, so you can control what operations users can do inside the system. Again, comes back to trust, right? So when IT turns it over to the system, you want to know that you've controlled exactly what kind of operations people can do. So when they go into the system, you know exactly what's going to happen. Leases and quotas. Again, this comes back to control. So this is controlling how long people can access the resources. We're talking about a mind shift or a user behavior shift over here. So in the traditional world, when people ask for resources, it takes a long time to get resources. So what that makes people do is hold on to resources longer than they need, because it took them so long to get these resources. They don't want to give it away, right? In the cloud model, so in Eddie's demo, you noticed that he went in, there was no IT, right? He was an end user. So it was a very simple interface. I have a catalog. I select what I want. I select the tier of service I want. And then I get what I want very quickly because it spins it up. When you start doing that, people, because it's so easy to get capacity, people are happy releasing capacity, right? So that drives higher utilization of your capacity, and it's right sizing infrastructure, making sure that things are reclaimed. There's no service sprawl, things like that. So leases and quotas will help you with this. So there's 2 types of leases: runtime and storage. Runtime tells you how long you can run a vApp, and storage is how long you can store a vApp when it's not running, right? And there's ways of deciding what to do once the storage lease expires. You can either delete it if you don't like the user, or you can put it in expired items, and you can choose to restore it if he does something, or he or she does something nice for you, right? Question?
So there's no approval process, it happens automatically?
In 1.0, there's no approval process. I'll let Eddie comment on features.
Yeah, the basic principle that we've been going with is that self-service means self-service. And the more people you put in between the provisioning request and the actual deployment of that object, the worse kind of the relationship sort of becomes. We are looking in the future at potentially adding some simple approval mechanisms in here. Generally speaking, we think, and this is a philosophical thing, so it's something that I'm happy to discuss or argue about, that the right place to put approvals is around, I'd like a VDC. You've given me some capacity, let me consume that VDC however is appropriate. Okay? That way, and that fits much better into this purchase a pool of capacity and then freely consume that capacity. And you want to expand that capacity? We'll go through an approval process. But
so we're looking at it, and then you don't need approval for 100% of your workload. So there's a considerable number of workloads that don't require approval. So we're talking about workloads that people want access to it quickly, and IT has done the work ahead of time, and it's blessed configuration. You're at the right patch levels. You're sort of maintaining a central catalog where you know that that's the one source of truth. So for a lot of workloads, you don't need approvals, but yes, there are certain workloads that do require approvals, and we're looking at that.
What was the question?
The question was, can you do that with Orchestrator? You would have to write.
You could wrap Orchestrator around vCloud using the vCloud API, and there is a plugin to the vCloud API for Orchestrator, but then you would have to write your approval workflow. There's
custom work needed fundamentally. I mean, it doesn't ship out of the box. There is an integration with vCenter Orchestrator. I won't have time to talk about that, but vCenter Orchestrator does ship workflows that allow you to run, to automate against the vCloud API, the admin API. But if you're doing things like approvals, then that's custom development. Yes, sir.
Right. Yep. Project Sydney would be one of those things like Orchestrator that you would wrap.
Project Sydney is a very well kept secret.
Yeah.
Like
no, it's being demoed at the booth. Project Sydney is essentially taking VSM, the VMware Service Manager. There are a lot of VSMs, and attaching it to Redwood.
In the interest of time, do you mind holding a question till the end if it's?
Thanks.
Very small question. Okay.
Go. Yep.
Yes.
So that's not even role-based access. That's just permissions on objects. It's just this is shared to everybody in the organization or to these 5 users.
And even the content, we haven't gotten into the content piece, but even when you create content, you can choose to share certain types of content with certain types of users and other content with other users. There's different ways of control. Okay, so we've layered on these organizations and we've onboarded users with AD and LDAP, and you've granted set policies and you've granted roles and rights, right? So let's start allocating resources to these organizations. So we created compute memory and networking resources as cloud resources, which are fundamentally shared. Let's see how we can divvy these up amongst organizations, right? So an organization VDC is what organizations use to consume compute and memory from a virtual data center. So an organization VDC is a portion or a chunk of your provider VDC. I say provider VDC because, again, we want IT to start thinking themselves as service providers in the business, right? So it's IT as a service. Organization VDCs can be as large as the provider VDC. And what this does is when an organization says, I want a certain level of service and I'm willing to pay a certain cost for it, certain amount of money for it, I create a organization VDC out of a provider VDC that provides that level of service and that acceptable cost. That's what we're doing. And multiple organizations can come in and consume portions of a provider VDC. And again, with vShield Edge and all the technology, multi-tenancy, isolation, all of that is guaranteed. And the vApps belong to organization. Actually, they belong to users, right? So fundamentally, and those run in these organization VDCs. So when you look down, it's actually running on ESX servers and resource pools and living on storage, data stores. 3 different ways of consuming resources in an organization VDC. The simplest one being pay-as-you-go. There's no allocation. There's no reservation ahead of time. The organization says, I want this level of service. And I don't know how my users are going to use it. I don't really have a sense of how much I need. So we'll just pay as we go. Right? That's most simplest way. And you just, you as IT just keep counting as more and more VMs are being deployed. You can set limits on how many VMs they can deploy or what's the maximum number of storage they can, maximum amount of storage they can use. TIN provisioning is supported. Allocation pool. This is where the organization says, I want a container. I kind of have a sense. But you as IT go, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think you have a good sense, right? So what I'm going to say is, okay, I'm going to make believe that the organization has 100% of what they asked for, but you as IT, you're doing some over allocation here. You're only guaranteeing 60% of that because you've seen their usage model and you know that they're not going to go over 60% most of the time, right? So you can over allocate inside that provider VDC. So it's kind of like the airline reservation model, right? So overbooking of seats. So when people show up later, gotta kick someone out.
The one advantage of the resource model and that vSphere provides is that unlike airlines, it is there's a lot of functionality inside of vSphere to allow you to share capacity, right? So transparent page sharing, memory compression, et cetera, all of those things mean that even if you are overcommitted on your infrastructure and consuming more than your infrastructure actually has, your performance impact is not as bad as, no, you can't fly to Phoenix today.
Right. And you're right, if you don't like someone, you can still kick them out. So, and the last one being reservation pool. This is where an organization says, you know what, I don't need you to play any funny games. I have the money and I want this entire container, right? So IT gives them a reservation. So this is again coming from resource pools and storage. So you're fundamentally blocking off that chunk away from any other organization. So if you have 100 shares and the organization comes in and is willing to pay for 60 shares, IT can just make that available to them. And then once the organization has that, they can over-allocate inside. So you give some advanced controls to the users where they can increase the number of CPU shares or memory shares. So they can play with the reservations on and shares of the vApps that are running inside this container. So 3 different models.
One thing worth pointing out is that these are the same 3 models that will be exposed in the vCloud data center offerings. And it's important to note that the reservation pool is the only model in which resource management controls are exposed to consumers. If you purchase something from a vCloud data center provider and resource controls are exposed to you, that means you are guaranteed the physical resources underneath. The service provider is not doing any funny business in the background with overcommitment. If you get an allocation pool, they may be doing overcommitment in the background. So you have the visibility to know what's going on if you so desire. You'll obviously pay more for the reservation pool, but as sophisticated vSphere users, that may be something you're interested in doing. Trade-offs.
Okay, so how do you allocate? So now that you've allocated compute and memory and storage, how do you allocate networking, right? So I talked about 2 different types of networks, the internal versus the external. So again, these sort of come into, I'm going to talk about how you take how you create organization networks that let you communicate inside an organization or externally outside the organization. So the first one is an internal network, and as you can imagine, all of the communication is restricted inside of an organization. These are powered by network pools. So if you remember, these are vNetwork distributed switches, and there's some isolation going on. So this is something that is a port group on a DV switch, and the VMs or the vApps in that organization sit and communicate on that. There's isolation. Nobody else can see what's going on. None of the other organizations can get to it, and these guys can't get to the outside. Second type of organization network, external routed. So here, most of the communication is inside, but you want to get out. So, but you don't want to, you don't want to live on the external network. So this is where the vShield Edge starts coming in. So this is, vCloud Director will deploy a vShield Edge appliance that sits in between the external network and the internal network and provide services like firewalling, NATing in, NATing out, for example, and DHCP services. So this allows you to, for the most part, they're talking to themselves inside, so nobody from the outside can get in, and things are NATing in, NATing out. You've got firewall rules set up, so it's a pretty secure way of communicating with the outside. And then finally, just open access, right? So you've got external networks that are outside, that are differentiated networks, and you want to be able to put your vApps directly on that network, because this could be something that's external facing, something in a DMC, you want to put it out on the web. Just put your vApps directly, connect them to an external direct connect organization network, and it's right there. The vApp gets an IP address directly on the external network. That's at the vSphere layer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not something that's available. So the question is, what if an organization requires inter-virtual machine segmentation that is not on a network-by-network isolation? So for example, if I have 2 virtual machines and I only want them to be able to talk to each other, I can drop them on a private vApp network or on an internal org network, and they're the only things that will talk to each other. If you need further segregation with the kind of zones or app-style technology, that's something that IT can set up outside of Redwood, outside of VCD. It's not something that is self-serviceable inside of VCD yet, and that's kind of the distinction and integration work. Understood. PCI compliance is it's a good example, right? Generally speaking, though, PCI compliance, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you are the only things on a particular network segment, you should be okay, and that's something that's available natively in VCD.
Cool. Thanks. Okay, so we've set up cloud resources. We've laid on organizations, users. We've allocated resources to these organizations, right? We've guaranteed security, isolation, multi-tenancy with the vShield Edge piece, and we've granted networking resources to organizations. Now, the last piece is giving access to content, right? Content is key. So why do users come to your cloud? Content. So the last piece is we use something called a catalog, and a catalog is where you store your vApp templates and your media files in the cloud, right? So these can be shared out inside an organization, so everyone in the organization can use, or for special organizations, IT for example, you can publish your content out to the entire cloud. So for example, if you've got your Windows images and your Linux images and other OS images, and you want one central source of truth, and this is where you're patching continuously and all of your compliance is in place, put them in this catalog and share them out to the entire cloud so everyone's deploying from this one source of truth. So you're pretty comfortable knowing that everyone has a blessed IT-blessed configuration or IT-blessed vApp in place. Examples of examples of catalogs, small, medium, and large. So this is the classic infrastructure as service. I want a VM and I want it fast, and I want a small VM or medium VM or a large VM. These could be operating systems that you deploy in there, or in some cases, you might even deploy applications in there, like database servers and application servers. It's much easier to deploy a OS because there's nothing fucking just guest OS customization, right? But when you deploy an app, you might need special configuration, and it depends. It varies on the app, and some apps might have 2 steps you need right after it comes up. Some apps might need 20 steps after it comes up, right? So, but vCloud Director does make it easy for you to push a customization script or an app customization script as part of the guest customization process. Again, it varies app to app. So we'd like to hear experiences with that. Yeah.
Just wondering, you can do the same thing with groups of vApps. So in other words, I have specific integration, lab manager transfer, being able to take them around to other places. I can do that completely.
Yes. So the question was, can I take groups of vApps and treat them as a special thing? A vApp and a lab manager configuration are roughly the same. So I can take a vApp and I can move it from organization to organization. I can also create groups of vApps in a catalog and create multiple catalogs. So I can have, for example, an OS images catalog, a golden apps catalog, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the one point I would add to that is when you do this, obviously you want to be careful about physical boundaries. So you don't want to be moving across the continental United States, for example, right? So you want to be thinking about how you can co-locate your catalog and your vApp templates with your end users. So if they're requesting, you want to make sure that it's somewhat relatively close to where they're requesting from. So you're not copying gigs of data over the wire. So it's again, going back to just design. Yeah. OS licenses? We're not.
No. We will allow you to count the number of VMs that have been deployed, but we're not counting specific counts of a particular VM or a particular child at this point. It's a feature request we've heard. I'll probably grab you afterwards and maybe dig in a little bit or drop me an email.
Yes.
So it's a good question. The question is, can you call an orchestrator workflow on guest customization or on provisioning? Today, the way that works is that it'll actually run a script inside of the virtual machine. If you can, and I'm not an orchestrator expert, so if inside of the virtual machine you can run a script which in turn fires off an orchestrator workflow, et cetera, yes. In the future, there may be some functionality to allow us to do that a little bit more natively. We're looking at some options in that regard.
So things to keep in mind, right? So it depends on where the vApp comes up, what network it's sitting on, if it can reach. So there's a lot of things to be able. So you need a vCenter orchestrator server that's somewhere on that same network listening. So with all these networks, I mean, it could be a vApp network, and you want to make sure that the vCenter orchestrator server is part of that. So just make sure that you have network access. So I believe it's possible. I haven't done that myself. Pool. There's a couple of different ways of doing this. When you create a network in vCloud Director, you can specify a pool of IP addresses to static IPs to hand out. Or you could, as the VMs come up, you could specify so you could have IT say, here's the IP address you should use, and the user can type that in as it comes up. So a couple of different ways of doing that.
The IP pool method is a lot more cloudy, if you will. It's a lot more self-service. And if you're pre-assigning static IP addresses, then those two things should map pretty directly. There was a question way at the back over there. Yes, sir. No, there are no gotchas. No. None.
None.
And these aren't the droids you're looking for either. So,
this is not software.
Generally speaking, if you can draw it on a piece of paper, you can implement it in VCD in terms of networking. You may consume several network segments to do that, right? So the 3-tier app that I showed before was relatively straightforward, but you can see how you would extrapolate that to say, okay, I want my database on a network that is only accessible by the app server, and you have an isolated L2 segment there, and then the app server is on a different L2 segment, which is only accessible by the web server, and a different L2 segment there, and so on and so forth. And you can drop firewalling in place and so forth. There's a lot of richness and a lot of complexity there. I would be somewhat surprised if you couldn't draw a networking architecture that you wanted to implement a business app around, but certainly I've been surprised before. So,
yeah. So the answer is yes, you can do it.
Yeah, you should be able to.
And there are no gotchas.
Yeah.
Okay, so we use, so I mentioned vApp a couple of times, so this is something that we use inside vCloud Director to package up multiple multi-tiered VMs into one unit. So this is using the OVF standard. Again, this is building block to enable the hybrid cloud. So when you start when you start connecting your private data center to your service provider data center, things like VPN connectivity and a way to package up applications and a way to also stream applications. So the OVF format as well as the vCloud API standards that we've got in place today that help you realize the hybrid cloud vision. How do you bring workloads into the cloud? There's a couple of different ways. Again, this is delegation of roles, right? So if it's an organization administrator that can add content to, or a user that's enabled or empowered to add content to the catalog, they can take an OVF file that's sitting on local disk or on some remote URL and stream that into the cloud, right? They have no sense of what the physical infrastructure is that's backing. All they see is a container, which is a VDC. They have no idea whether it's coming from a private data center or a public service provider data center. All they want to do is they want to stream some content and make it available to the end user. So they just find that file, find the OVF file, and put it into the cloud. If, on the other hand, you are a cloud administrator and you've got this, you want to suck in existing applications and you want to bring them into the cloud, you have access to vSphere. And so you, as cloud administrator, can then choose the VMs that you want to bring in as templates. So you've got existing machines that are in your vSphere infrastructure, and you can bring them also into the cloud. So a couple of different ways of bringing into the cloud. And if you're a user, you can just create a VM and install guest OS, and you can do that also inside vCloud Director. So 3 ways, really. Backup and recovery, fully supported with vCloud Director. You can use traditional backup and recovery methods, so it's like an agent-based method. Obviously, the networking topology matters, so you want to make sure that everything is in place. VMware does recommend VADP-based backup solutions. There are some nuances about how you do recovery in the cloud. It's not the exact same as in a non-cloud environment. So we're writing up a blog post. It'll be available. We're writing up a KB article, and it'll be available on the VMware KB article base, knowledge base, as well as that blog right there. So we're writing it up right now. So just how does the recovery process change a little bit when you recover into the cloud? Okay, so let me summarize quickly. So we started out with this picture, which was pretty complicated, a lot of steps, a lot of moving parts. What we have done with vCloud Director is, first of all, we've separated out roles. And the first role that you saw was what I talked about was the cloud administrator role. Now this guy does all the heavy lifting, so planning and making sure the foundation is solid, goes through a certain number of steps. Again, not a lot of steps, just going through what I talked about, and creates cloud resources, organizations, and allocates resources to those organizations. Now you do this, it's one operation that you have to think about, make sure everything is solid when you first do it, but then it's relatively infrequent on an ongoing basis. The second role we talked about was the organization administrator. Again, this is delegation of roles, a certain set of roles like the user management and the catalog and content management inside an organization can be delegated to the organization administrator. Again, when you first create the organization, you want to plan and you want to make sure everything is okay. But then as users come in and they start consuming, it doesn't change too much, right? So it's relatively infrequent on that basis. And then finally, end users who just come in and have a go at the system, right? So the model really is, users come in and it's self-provisioning, quick access to resources, the agility, the quick time to market for applications, all of those things you've been hearing about, right? And IT doesn't even insert itself into the picture, except when you need some sort of approval process, which we're working on. All right, just I want to close out right here. And so one thing I've not talked about is chargeback. In the interest of time, I've not talked about chargeback, but these slides will be posted on the web for you to download afterwards, and chargeback is part of this, so you can see how you set up chargeback in the cloud system. It's part of the presentation. And also, it's kind of late for the other sessions. I'm not sure how many a lot of these sessions have already passed again.
Rather than taking notes on this slide, Greg in the back of the room, who's the product marketing manager for VCD, is handing out cards with exactly this data on it. So on your way out, grab a card.
And then when you download presentations, you'll have a list of all the related presentations, so you can download them off the web, so you can get all that content about VCD.
Okay.
And then we'll break for questions. I can take questions.
Yeah.
Eddie can take questions, and Greg in the back can also take questions. He's our product marketing manager.
Thanks, guys.